Fort Bragg, one of the most prestigious military bases in the United States, was known for its relentless training, grueling drills, and the highest standard of elite soldiers. It was the home of the best and brightest, those who had been chosen to represent the pinnacle of modern military prowess. Sergeant Jake Carson, a young sniper and team leader, was one of those soldiers. His reputation on the range was unmatched. With his sharp aim and quick reflexes, Carson had proven time and time again that no one could outshoot him. His team looked up to him, and his pride in his abilities was evident in every step he took. On this particular day, Carson and his team were preparing for another round of training, with targets set at distances that would test even the most seasoned snipers. They were equipped with the latest rifles, each designed for maximum precision, each boasting cutting-edge technology to ensure a perfect shot every time. The members of his team were in high spirits, joking and laughing, their confidence radiating as they checked their gear. They were in their element, ready to prove once again that their superior technology would ensure their success on any battlefield. "All right, team," Carson said, his voice smooth and confident. "Let's see if we can break our own record today. No mistakes. Perfect shots." His words were met with nods of agreement, their faces hardening into expressions of focus. Carson scanned the training range, checking the weather conditions and gauging the wind. Everything looked perfect for a flawless day of shooting. It was all too easy, and Carson knew it. But just as the team was about to begin their first round of firing, something unexpected happened. An elderly man, appearing from out of nowhere, walked slowly onto the range. He was dressed in tattered, weathered clothing, his gray hair and beard a sharp contrast to the modern military uniforms around him. His movements were slow, deliberate, but there was an unmistakable aura of quiet confidence about him. In his hand, he carried nothing more than an old bow and a quiver of arrows, a sight that caused the entire team to freeze in disbelief. Carson turned to his team, a smirk spreading across his face. "What's this? A field trip to the Renaissance Fair," he chuckled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The snipers around him laughed, exchanging amused glances. A bow? What could an old man with such an ancient weapon possibly do on their high-tech training range? The elderly man didn't acknowledge the mockery. He simply continued his walk toward the nearest target. When he was only a few feet away, Carson's smile faded. The old man stopped, his eyes meeting Carson's. "I have clearance to use this range," the man said, his voice calm but firm. Carson raised an eyebrow. "You've got clearance? With a bow and arrow?" The elderly man nodded once. "Yes. I was told this is a place for all kinds of training." A moment of stunned silence fell over the group. Carson's team, still skeptical, looked at each other, unsure how to react. This was a sniper's range, not a place for ancient weapons. The old man was clearly out of his element. Carson's pride swelled. This was the perfect opportunity to prove that their advanced technology made everything else obsolete. He could dismiss the old man easily, showing him and his bow just how outclassed they were. "All right, old man," Carson said, stepping forward. "I'll make you a deal. You want to use the range, you'll have to prove you can keep up. You see that target out there?" He pointed to a small distant speck 900 yards away, nestled in a valley known as the Devil's Anvil. The wind was notoriously unpredictable in that part of the range, with swirling gusts that could send even the most seasoned shooters into a tailspin. The team watched eagerly, knowing that the conditions made it near impossible to hit the target with a rifle, let alone a bow. Carson's smirk returned. "If you can hit that target with your little bow, then you can stay. Otherwise, pack up and leave." The old man didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He simply nodded and walked toward the spot where the range officials had set up his target. Carson was sure this would be over quickly. He and his team had been shooting for years, and they had all the tools they needed to succeed. No way an old man with a bow could hit anything at that distance, especially with the wind conditions. The snipers set up their positions, watching with a mix of curiosity and amusement as McAllister took his place. They made sure their scopes were zeroed in on the target, the 900-yard mark shimmering faintly through the haze of the wind. "All right, McAllister," Carson said, his voice oozing with confidence. "Let's see what you've got." The elderly man didn't respond. He simply lifted the bow, his movements smooth and practiced. With a steady hand, he nocked an arrow and drew the bowstring back. Every action was calculated, precise. He didn't seem to mind the swirling gusts of wind that tugged at the air around him, as if he were part of the very atmosphere itself. Carson's team whispered among themselves. He's going to miss. This is ridiculous. This is just embarrassing. But there was something mesmerizing about the old man's calm presence. The way he stood there, unbothered by their laughter, as if he was in his own world. The old man released the arrow. Time seemed to slow. The arrow arced high into the air, soaring above the heads of the snipers. It twisted and turned, dancing with the wind, higher and higher, until it reached its apex. For a brief moment, it seemed to hang there in the sky, like some strange omen. Then, with a subtle shift of its trajectory, it began to descend. Every sniper watched, their breath caught in their throats. It was impossible to track the arrow's flight with their scopes. It seemed to defy every rule of physics. The wind howled around them, but the arrow came down, spiraling with deadly precision. And then, with a soft thunk, it struck the center of the target. The team was silent. Carson blinked in disbelief. "No way," he muttered under his breath. The elderly man, John McAllister, stood still for a moment, his hand still raised, as if waiting for the wind to carry the arrow to its final destination. He lowered his bow and turned to face Carson and his team, the faintest hint of a smile on his weathered face. "You asked to see what I could do," McAllister said simply, his voice steady and calm. Carson's pride was shattered in that instant. What had just happened? The impossible shot, no, the impossible feat, had been accomplished. An old man with a bow had done what their high-tech rifles couldn't. The silence on the range stretched on, until the sound of approaching boots broke it. Colonel Robert James, the commanding officer of the base, appeared on the scene, his face stern as he approached Carson and his team. The colonel's eyes briefly flicked to the target, then to the old man. "Sergeant Carson," Colonel James said, his tone sharp, "I think it's time you learned a lesson." And with that, the air around them shifted. Carson felt a coldness wash over him, his chest tightening with the realization that something far more profound than just marksmanship was about to unfold before him. The wind, once a constant companion in the valley, seemed to still as Colonel Robert James stepped onto the training range. His presence alone commanded respect, and the snipers, who had once laughed at the sight of McAllister's bow, now stood motionless, awaiting the inevitable reprimand. Carson, his face flushed with disbelief, tried to gather his thoughts, but the colonel's gaze bore into him like a weight he couldn't escape. "Sergeant Carson," Colonel James began, his voice cold but measured, "do you know who this man is?" Carson shook his head, still unable to reconcile what he had just witnessed. The elderly man, McAllister, had done the impossible. He had hit a target that even the most advanced rifles and technology couldn't touch. It was as though the laws of physics had bent to his will. "No, sir," Carson replied, his voice stiff. I don't know who he is." The colonel glanced at McAllister, who stood with his bow still slung across his back, his expression serene as if nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred. There was no boast, no pride. He was simply there, present in the moment, waiting for the colonel's next words. "This is Master Sergeant John McAllister," Colonel James continued, his voice reverberating with a weight that seemed to echo across the range. "A name that should be etched in every soldier's mind. But most of you, I'm sure, have never heard it before." Carson, feeling the sting of ignorance, shot a glance at his team. No one dared to speak, the silence thickening as the realization of the old man's identity began to sink in. Master Sergeant McAllister, the colonel went on, was a legend in the Vietnam War. They called him the Phantom, and for good reason. He operated alone behind enemy lines, using nothing but a bow to take out high-value targets. No one ever saw him coming, and no one ever knew he was there until the job was done. His accuracy with that bow was unmatched, and his ability to move silently through hostile terrain became the stuff of legends. The snipers looked at one another in stunned silence. The man they had mocked, the man they had belittled for wielding an archaic weapon, was no ordinary civilian. He was a living legend, someone whose name was whispered in awe among those who truly understood the art of war. And now this same man was standing before them, offering them a lesson they hadn't asked for, but one they desperately needed. During the war, McAllister was responsible for countless kills, all without a single shot fired from a rifle, Colonel James continued, his gaze steady. In fact, he never once used a gun. His weapon of choice was always a bow and arrow, and he was so skilled that no one could even track him. He didn't need the technology you rely on so heavily today. The weight of the colonel's words settled like a heavy fog over Carson. The arrogance he had felt just moments ago, when he had mocked McAllister for his ancient weapon, seemed foolish now. Carson shifted uncomfortably, his pride quickly crumbling. McAllister, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, broke his silence. His voice was calm, steady, like a man who had long since accepted the weight of his reputation. "You see," McAllister said, looking directly at Carson, "it's not about the weapon you hold. It's about how well you understand the world around you. It's about knowing how to read the wind, how to feel the earth beneath your feet, how to become part of your surroundings. Technology is a tool, yes, but it cannot replace the knowledge and intuition you develop over time. A sniper's true skill is in his ability to make the impossible seem effortless." Carson stood frozen, struck by the simplicity of McAllister's words. The old man wasn't just teaching them about shooting, he was teaching them about life, about mastery, about understanding things on a deeper level. Colonel James nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's exactly that kind of wisdom we've been missing," he said. "You, Carson, and your team have become so reliant on your gadgets and your tech that you've forgotten the most basic principles of marksmanship. You rely on wind meters, scopes, laser targeting systems, but you've neglected the most important tool you have, the ability to read the world around you, to understand the environment in which you operate." The colonel's words hit Carson like a punch to the gut. He'd spent so many years perfecting his craft with technology that he'd never thought to question whether there was something more to learn. He'd never considered that there could be something deeper, something more fundamental that he was missing. McAllister's eyes softened as he looked at Carson, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "It's not about how advanced your rifle is, Carson. It's about patience. It's about taking the time to study the wind, to wait for the right moment. Technology can't teach you that." The old man paused, letting his words sink in. He then reached into his quiver and pulled out another arrow, inspecting it carefully before looking back at the team. "Let me show you something," McAllister said, his voice low but sure. He walked slowly toward a new target set up at the far end of the range, a different one this time, closer, yet still a challenging distance away. The team watched, unsure of what to expect. Would the old man attempt another impossible shot? Would they witness another display of skill that would defy all logic? McAllister stood still for a moment, feeling the air around him, letting his senses take in the world. The wind was shifting now, stronger than before, pushing against him from the left. He could feel the temperature of the air, the subtle pressure in the atmosphere. The moment seemed to stretch, each second heavier than the last. Carson and his team watched, their rifles resting in their hands, their eyes glued to McAllister. There was no rush in his movements, no eagerness to prove himself. He simply waited. When he finally drew the bowstring back, his focus was absolute. It wasn't just the target he was aiming at, it was the entire world around him. The wind, the shifting air, the subtle vibrations beneath his feet, all of it came together in that moment. McAllister released the arrow. The flight was smooth, a perfect arc as the arrow sailed through the air, carving its path through the shifting winds. Time seemed to stop as they watched it approach the target. And then, with a quiet thunk, the arrow struck dead center. The snipers gasped, their disbelief palpable. It had happened again, another perfect shot, another display of skill that defied their understanding of what was possible. Carson, who had once thought of McAllister as an old fool, now felt a deep sense of humility. The lessons he had dismissed as irrelevant were becoming crystal clear in that moment. Colonel James looked at the team with a stern expression. "This is what true mastery looks like," he said. "This is what you should be striving for. Technology can help you, but it can never replace the foundation of skill. Now it's time to learn." The team stood in stunned silence, the weight of the lesson settling over them. Carson, still reeling from the events, couldn't help but wonder how much they had overlooked in their pursuit of perfection through technology. The colonel and McAllister had just opened a door to a world they hadn't even known existed. The wind was still, but there was an electricity in the air that couldn't be ignored. The snipers stood in a semicircle around McAllister, their eyes fixed on the old man who had just shattered their understanding of marksmanship. The lesson was far from over, and Carson could feel the weight of it pressing down on him like a storm cloud gathering overhead. He had once believed that his high-tech rifle was the ultimate weapon, a tool that could never be matched. Now the reality was sinking in. Technology was only one piece of the puzzle. There was something far more profound that he had yet to understand. McAllister stood quietly, his bow slung across his back once more, his eyes scanning the horizon as if he were waiting for something, an invisible cue perhaps, or the right moment to speak. The air around them seemed to grow stiller, more deliberate, as if the entire world was holding its breath. "Gather around," McAllister said, his voice low but carrying through the silence. His tone was not that of a teacher instructing students, but rather that of a fellow soldier sharing knowledge with those who could understand. He had nothing to prove. The snipers obeyed, forming a loose circle around McAllister, who lowered himself to sit cross-legged in the grass, his bow still resting by his side. The colonel, standing nearby, nodded in approval and stepped aside, allowing McAllister to take the lead. Carson hesitated for a moment, his instincts telling him to stay on guard, to keep his distance. But there was something compelling about the old man's presence, something that spoke to him beyond his pride, beyond his ego. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Carson joined the circle. McAllister waited until everyone was settled before speaking again. "The wind is your greatest ally and your most dangerous enemy," he began, his voice calm yet carrying the weight of experience. "A sniper who cannot read the wind is no better than a blind man with a rifle. You rely on technology to tell you what the wind is doing, but no gadget can teach you how to feel the air. No device can tell you the subtle shifts in pressure, the warm gusts that signal a change, or the invisible forces that swirl around you. To truly understand wind, you must become part of it." Carson, though still bristling with a mix of disbelief and humility, listened intently. He had always relied on wind meters and his rifle's advanced targeting system to guide him, trusting technology to do the work for him. It seemed impossible that an old man, with nothing but his senses, could teach them anything of value. McAllister continued, his eyes distant as though recalling long-forgotten memories. "In the jungles of Vietnam, the wind was my ally. It guided me to my targets, warned me of danger, and concealed my movements. I learned to read it like a language, its whispers, its shifts, its patterns. It told me when to move, when to stay still, when to fire, and when to wait." The snipers exchanged glances, each of them beginning to recognize that McAllister wasn't just talking about shooting, he was talking about something much deeper, something that went beyond the rifle or the bow. This was about understanding the world in a way they had never been taught. This was about becoming one with nature, not just using it as a backdrop for their operations. "The bow is just a tool," McAllister said, looking at each of them. "It's not the weapon that makes the marksman. It's the understanding of the environment, the patience to wait for the right moment, and the skill to use whatever you have to its fullest potential." Carson's mind raced, and for the first time, he began to question everything he had been taught about warfare. In his world, speed and precision were everything. It had always been about hitting the target, using the best technology, and making the shot quickly. But McAllister was telling them that the true skill came from something deeper, something intangible. It wasn't enough to simply know how to shoot. You had to know how to exist in the world, how to feel it, how to anticipate it. McAllister stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, like a man who had nothing left to prove. He turned to face the wind, which had begun to stir again, swirling around them in unpredictable gusts. "Let me show you," he said simply, as if the words had been enough to set the stage for something monumental. Carson felt a surge of skepticism. He had no doubt that McAllister was skilled, but the challenge ahead seemed almost impossible. The snipers had been taught to rely on the technology that made their jobs easier, their tasks more predictable. What McAllister was offering wasn't just a lesson in shooting, it was a lesson in living, in becoming something more than a soldier with a weapon. The old man reached for his bow, knocking an arrow with practiced ease. There was no rush in his movements, no tension in his body, just the fluid, natural rhythm of someone who had spent decades mastering his craft. He took a moment to feel the air, to assess the wind. His eyes closed briefly, as though he were listening to something only he could hear. Carson stood at the edge of the group, watching with a mixture of awe and doubt. Was McAllister really going to do it again? Was he going to hit another target at a nearly impossible distance, with nothing but his bow? McAllister's eyes opened, and without a word, he turned to face the target at the far end of the range. This time, it was over 1,000 yards away. The wind howled again, swirling violently, as though it were testing the old man's resolve. "You all think technology is the answer," McAllister said, as if speaking directly to Carson. "You think gadgets and gadgets alone make you unstoppable. But the real question is, How well do you understand the world you're trying to control? How well do you know the forces that govern it? The snipers looked at each other, the weight of McAllister's words sinking in. For the first time, they began to understand that it wasn't about just mastering the weapon, it was about understanding everything that led up to that moment. McAllister took a deep breath and released the arrow. Carson watched, holding his breath, as the arrow soared into the sky, twisting and turning with the wind. It seemed to dance through the air, as though guided by an invisible hand. Carson's eyes followed its flight, his mind trying to comprehend what he was witnessing. The arrow descended with perfect precision, slicing through the air and striking the target dead center once again. A perfect shot. The snipers stood stunned, their mouths agape. Carson could feel the heat of his own embarrassment, but it was mixed with a new, undeniable sense of respect. He had watched the old man do something that no one else had been able to do. But more than that, McAllister had done it with a kind of effortless mastery that could only come from decades of experience, from truly understanding the environment he operated in. McAllister turned to face the team, his expression calm, his eyes clear. Patience, intuition, and understanding. These are the qualities that will make you a true marksman. Not your gadgets, not your rifles, but your ability to read the world around you. For the first time in his life, Carson felt small. He realized that there was a level of mastery that he had never even considered, a level that went beyond technology, beyond equipment, beyond the very weapon in his hands. And in that moment, he knew that his journey as a sniper had only just begun. The training range at Fort Bragg had never felt quite like this before. The air was thick with the weight of McAllister's lesson, and the snipers who had once prided themselves on their superiority now found themselves grappling with a humbling truth. They had been blind to the true nature of their craft. The realization had set in for Carson and his team. What McAllister had shown them went far beyond skill with a weapon. It was about understanding, feeling, and becoming one with everything around them. The wind, the earth, the air, it was all connected, and it was all a part of the precision that made a true marksman. The snipers stood in a loose circle around McAllister, still processing the impossibility of the shot they had just witnessed. The target, 1,000 yards away, had been nothing more than a faint blur to their eyes. But McAllister, with his bow and a single arrow, had struck it perfectly. Without hesitation, without rushing. Just pure, unyielding focus. McAllister was quiet now, his hands resting on his knees as he gazed out over the range, his bow lying still beside him. Carson, unable to stand in the silence any longer, finally spoke. "I don't get it," he admitted, his voice uncharacteristically raw. "How do you do it? How can you read the wind so well? I've never even thought about that before." McAllister turned his head to look at Carson, his gaze steady, thoughtful. "You're not meant to control the wind, Carson," he said softly. "You're meant to learn from it. You can't force it to be something it's not. It's like trying to make the sea still, it's impossible. But you can become attuned to its rhythm. You can understand when it's about to change, when it's pushing you in a certain direction." Carson frowned. "But you've been doing this for years. I don't know if I can ever get to that point." The old man smiled faintly, as if he had heard this same question countless times before. "Patience, Sergeant. Mastery doesn't come overnight. It comes in moments like this, when you stop, when you listen, and when you allow yourself to learn. You'll never get it all at once. But if you give yourself the time, the patience to learn from the smallest things around you, that's when you'll start to see the world differently." The words sank deep into Carson's thoughts, but his mind was still fighting the instinct to rely on technology. It felt foreign to him, this idea of waiting, of observing before acting. He had always been trained to take the shot, to move quickly and decisively. Patience was a luxury he hadn't known how to afford. The colonel, who had been standing quietly off to the side, stepped forward now. "McAllister's right, Carson. And all of you," he said, turning to the team. "You've been taught to be fast, precise, efficient. But efficiency comes from understanding the timing, not just the mechanics. The more you understand the environment, the more accurate your timing will be. Technology can't replace your instincts. It can only enhance them." McAllister nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And that's why, for the next part of your training, I'm going to teach you how to embrace patience. You'll learn how to wait for the perfect moment, not rush into it. It's a test of both your skill and your mind." The snipers exchanged uncertain glances. Carson felt the challenge before it had even begun. The thought of waiting for the right moment felt almost alien to him. In his world, hesitation was a liability. "Let's begin," McAllister said, standing up slowly, his eyes scanning the range. "Your task is simple, but it's going to challenge everything you've been trained to do. I'm going to give each of you a target, and you'll take turns firing on it. But the catch is, you cannot shoot until you've felt the wind. You must understand its movement, and only then will you release your shot. Don't rush. Don't force it. You'll wait until the wind tells you what to do." The snipers looked skeptical, but they were ready. After all, how hard could it be? Just wait for the right moment, feel the wind. It seemed simple enough. But as they took their positions, Carson could already feel the challenge creeping in. He was used to precise calculations, relying on his equipment to tell him exactly when to fire. Now there were no tools, no meters to check. Just him, his weapon, and the world around him. Carson was the first to step up to the line. He took a deep breath and looked out at the target, a mere 300 yards away. The wind was light, shifting back and forth. It didn't feel consistent, didn't feel right. But Carson, eager to prove himself, lifted his rifle anyway, adjusting the scope and preparing to take the shot. McAllister's voice cut through the silence. "Not yet. Wait for the wind to speak to you." Carson froze, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He was already itching to fire, to hit the target and show McAllister that he could do this. He had trained for this moment, hadn't he? But the old man's words rang in his ears. "Patience," McAllister repeated, his tone calm but firm. Carson sighed, lowering the rifle. He had already made the decision to fire, but McAllister had challenged him to wait. His eyes flicked to the wind meter at his side, a tiny part of him still wanting to use the technology, still wanting to trust his gadgets. But the moment passed. The wind shifted once again, and Carson felt it, just a faint change in direction, a subtle, almost imperceptible gust. He raised his rifle again, this time more deliberately. He could feel the wind pushing against him, almost guiding him. He aimed at the target, waiting for that perfect alignment. The wind spoke to him, just like McAllister had said. It wasn't a command or an order, it was simply a shift, a change in the rhythm of the world around him. Finally, when he felt it, Carson squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the bullet hit the target, dead center. A collective breath went out from the team. Carson stood there, staring at the target in awe. The hit wasn't just precise, it was clean, effortless, just as McAllister had described. The wind had spoken, and Carson had listened. McAllister smiled faintly, nodding in approval. "That was the first step, Carson. Now, you begin to understand." Carson stood, his heart still racing, but there was a calmness within him now. He had done it, not because of technology, but because he had listened. He had let the wind guide him, just as McAllister had taught. One by one, the snipers took their turns. Some struggled, trying to force the shot before the wind had spoken to them. Others, like Carson, waited. And as they did, they began to see the world differently. The lesson wasn't about speed, it wasn't about gadgets, it wasn't even about precision, it was about patience, intuition, and trust in the world around them. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the range, the snipers knew that they were no longer the same soldiers who had walked onto that field that morning. They had taken the first step toward mastery. And the journey, they now understood, was just beginning. The training range at Fort Bragg had never been more still. The snipers, each of them deeply immersed in their own thoughts, were far from their usual cocky, confident selves. Gone was the bravado, the arrogant swagger that had defined them. In its place was a quiet humility, a deep respect for the lessons they were learning from an unexpected source, an old man with a bow. McAllister had shown them something they hadn't even known they were missing. As each sniper took their turn on the range, they practiced what he had taught them: patience, the art of waiting for the perfect moment, listening to the wind and the world around them. They began to understand the rhythm of nature in a way they never had before, and with each shot, they saw the world shift ever so slightly. They didn't just fire with precision, they fired with intention, guided by something far more profound than technology or gadgets. Carson, standing at the edge of the group, watched as his team took their turns. His own experience had been transformative, but there was still a part of him that struggled with what McAllister had shown them. The old man had forced him to confront his deepest fears about being a soldier, the fear of not having control, the fear of waiting, of being patient. In his world, control was everything. The more you controlled, the safer you were. But McAllister had stripped that illusion away, showing him that control was an illusion in itself. The world, the wind, nature, they were the true masters. Carson was just the instrument. He turned his gaze toward McAllister, who stood apart from the group, silently watching his students. The old man had been a soldier in ways Carson could scarcely comprehend. There was no ego in McAllister, no desire to show off or prove anything. Everything he did seemed effortless, a perfect balance of wisdom and action. It was this balance that Carson now sought to achieve. "McAllister," Carson said, walking over to the older man, "I have to admit, I'm still having a hard time with this. I've spent my whole life training to be fast, to hit my target without hesitation. And now, you've taught me to wait, to listen. I don't know if I can just let go of everything I've been taught. It feels unnatural." McAllister turned to face him, his expression calm, patient. "It's supposed to feel unnatural, Carson. That's the point. You've been taught to react to the world as if it's something to be conquered. But it's not. You must learn to flow with it, to understand it, to become part of it. Only then will you find your true power." Carson frowned, still unsure of how to reconcile what he had just learned with the soldier he had been. The idea of letting go of control, of trusting the environment, seemed like the opposite of everything he had been trained for. But there was something in McAllister's words that struck a chord deep within him, a truth that resonated, even if he wasn't yet ready to accept it fully. "I guess I'll just have to keep trying," Carson said, his voice quieter than usual. "But, how did you learn all this? How did you become what you are?" McAllister's eyes softened, and for the first time, there was a hint of something personal in his gaze. "It wasn't easy, Carson. I had to unlearn everything I thought I knew. In the jungles of Vietnam, I was forced to adapt, to survive. I had to become part of the environment, to understand it in ways that went beyond weapons and tactics. The bow became my way of connecting with the world around me. It was never just about taking a shot, it was about understanding everything that led up to that moment. The wind, the temperature, the sound of the leaves in the trees, the movement of the animals, all of it spoke to me. And in time, I learned to listen." Carson nodded slowly. It was starting to make sense, but there was still so much more to grasp. He had learned how to take a shot in the moment, to trust his senses and instincts, but it wasn't enough. There was an entire world he had yet to understand, an entire dimension to marksmanship that transcended anything technology could provide. McAllister reached down and picked up his bow, holding it out to Carson. "You're ready for your next lesson," he said, his voice steady, filled with quiet confidence. Carson's eyes widened. He had never used a bow before, not even once. The idea of switching from his trusted rifle to an archaic weapon felt absurd. He had always thought of himself as a sniper, a master of long-range shooting, a soldier who relied on the most advanced technology to do his job. But McAllister wasn't asking him to become a bowman. He was asking him to understand something that went beyond the weapon itself. Carson hesitated, then slowly took the bow from McAllister's hands. It felt strange in his grip, unfamiliar, the wooden shaft smooth beneath his fingers. He knocked an arrow, just as he had seen McAllister do, and drew the bowstring back, the tension pulling against him. "Just like the wind," McAllister said, his voice calm, "let it guide you. Don't force it. Feel it. Let the arrow fly when the moment is right." Carson stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the bow in his hands. It was heavier than he expected, but it wasn't the weight of the weapon he was concerned with, it was the weight of the lesson. The pressure to succeed, to hit the target, was still there. But now, there was something more. Something deeper. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to clear his mind, to empty himself of the distractions that had clouded his thoughts for so long. The wind shifted. Carson could feel the subtle tug of it, a gentle push against the back of his neck. He opened his eyes and, without thinking, released the arrow. The sound of the bowstring snapping echoed across the range. The arrow flew through the air, spinning in a perfect arc. Carson watched, holding his breath, as it descended toward the target. The arrow struck true. It wasn't a perfect shot, not as clean as the one McAllister had made, but it was close. It was a hit, and that was enough. Carson stood there, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. Not because he had hit the target, but because he had listened. For the first time, he had felt the moment, had waited for the wind, and had trusted himself enough to release the shot. McAllister smiled, nodding in approval. Good. Now, you're starting to understand. Carson lowered the bow, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. The lessons were far from over, but for the first time, he was beginning to see the world differently. It wasn't about technology or gadgets. It wasn't about rushing, about hitting the target with mechanical precision. It was about understanding, about patience, about listening to the world around him. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the range, and the snipers stood together, united by the lessons they had learned. They were no longer the same soldiers who had walked onto that field weeks ago. They had changed, had been transformed by McAllister's wisdom, his lessons about mastery, patience, and the power of nature. Carson felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not just for himself, but for the team, for what they could become if they embraced the lessons that McAllister had shown them. He looked up at the old man, who was now standing apart from the group, his bow resting in his hands as he gazed out at the horizon. The journey had only just begun, but Carson knew one thing for certain: he was ready to walk the path, no matter where it led.